Okay, can you hear me? This thing works, awesome. Hello, my name is Martin Fackler. I'm the Tokyo Bureau Chief with the New York Times, and I'm also the host of this panel. This is the first afternoon session of the second day of the Asan Plenum. I don't think Ham Chae-bong is here, but I wanted to say thank you again to the Asan Institute and to Ham Chae-bong and to Jung Mong-jun and everyone who has made this possible, because I really think this is a wonderful and stimulating event, and I'm beginning to think this really is the best conference in Asia, and so it really is a pleasure to be here. I'd also like to thank Ambassador Besho, who has come, Ambassador to South Korea from Japan, so we have some distinguished guests. And I'd also like to thank all of you for coming. I know it's very difficult after lunch to sit through a session. Maybe you get a bit sleepy. But I think that today, sleepiness may not be a problem, because we're going to be diving into a very important and interesting topic, but also one that can be very emotional, and one that involves this country, South Korea, and also Japan, and also my country, the United States. So, the title of the panel, I think, really says it all. Never been worse, ? Korea-Japan relations. And frankly, I think you probably could remove the question mark. I've been writing about Japan and Korea, South Korea, for 12 years, and have been watching it for longer than that. And I have to say that this is probably about the worst I've seen it. There may be some hairs to split. Maybe some folks in the panel will have a slightly different view, but it's pretty, I would say relations are at a low point in some important ways. And to me, really the sort of key piece of evidence for that is the fact that the president of South Korea, Park Geun-hye, and the prime minister of Japan, Abe Shinzo, haven't really had a meeting. I mean, they've met this sort of shotgun wedding on the side of a meeting at the Hague with the United States, but they really haven't had a real summit. And if you think of how much these countries have in common, right? South Korea and Japan, how similar they are in so many ways. Two democracies in East Asia, two very affluent and sophisticated and highly successful economic systems, industrial or post-industrial, still industrial, I suppose, economies. They face the same challenges, North Korea, and in a different sense, China, and they are both key allies of the United States, and yet their leaders can't seem to even have a conversation. And, we know the story that the dividing issue we hear is history, right? That there's a perception in South Korea that the Japanese don't really feel remorse, they can't really apologize. In Tokyo, the word I hear these days is Korea fatigue. People are tired of apologizing, and they feel that South Korea, is using history as a tool or a weapon or something for contemporary political aims. And so for the United States, interestingly, this inability of South Korea and Japan to work together, despite their common challenges, is frankly a great source of frustration. When I talk to US officials, I hear that, like, what is going on? Why can't these guys talk? And so we are going to dive into these shark-infested waters of history and contemporary regional politics. And we have an incredibly talented lineup of speakers to guide us in our journey through these dangerous waters. Let me quickly introduce them. On my immediate left is Alexis Dudden, who, frankly, is a very provocative thinker She's gotten a lot of attention recently in Japan, also in the US and South Korea for her viewpoints and her analysis of issues in Northeast Asia, history, territory, apology. She's written 2 books, at least. Is it just 2?
That's not nice.
It's 2 more than me in English.
Almost finished.
Okay. But Troubled Apologies Among Japan, Korea, and the United States, and Japan's Colonization of Korea. And she is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. She's gotten a Fulbright Fellowship to Japan and Korea, and a number of other grants at places you've probably heard of called Princeton and Harvard. On her left is Pak Chol-hee, who is, I think, one of the leading South Korean experts on Japan today. He is the professor, I think, aren't you the director of the Japan Studies program at Seoul National University?
Yes, Institute for Japanese Studies.
Institute for Japanese Studies. You've also taught at, is it KO? Is that correct? No.
GRIPS.
GRIPS, thank you.
Yes.
The graduate school for...
the National Accredited Institute for Policy Studies.
Thank you.
Very complex
Thank you,
name.
thank you. But one of the top kind of social policy graduate schools in Japan. Also a policy advisor for the, I assume this is the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
They don't listen to me, so.
Okay. Well, that's why there's so many problems. To his left is Professor Nishino Junya, who, frankly, this is a man to watch. He's a rising star, I think, in Japanese studies of Korea. Associate Professor of Political Science at Keio University, one of the top schools in Japan. He was previously a special analyst on Korean affairs for the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he was a Japan scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a visiting scholar at the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University. And last but not least, Mr. Scott Snyder. I think Scott's one of the best known and most respected US experts on South Korea, senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the Korea Studies program for the Council on Foreign Relations. You were previously at the Asia Foundation, where I think you also headed the Korea Studies program, and you were the resident representative here in Korea for a few years, as I recall. And you've been a Pantech visiting fellow at Stanford, which I'm not sure that exists anymore, and also an Abe fellow, which I hope doesn't color your views. But thank you all for being here. We're going to ask everyone to talk for 3 to 5 minutes. And I'm going to ask a question that I hope you answer. Ask the same question to all 4, not a trick question. But before I do, I just wanted to say this is a very important moment for this panel to take place. Ham Chae-bong throws these wonderful conferences, and I don't know how he did it this time, but he managed to convince Abe to speak tonight after our panel. So I don't know how you did that, Ham, but it was wonderful timing. So you guys amaze me. So tonight, Prime Minister Abe will be speaking to a joint session of Congress, the first Japanese Prime Minister ever to do so. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Ever? I mean, going back to Meiji, I mean, ever, right? Mm-hmm. Usually people say ever, they mean post-war. So truly the first one ever, right?
It is historical.
And what he says will be closely watched, of course, in Japan and in the US, but maybe most closely watched here in Seoul. Mm-hmm. So let me ask a very broad question to start it off to all 4 of you. Are Korean-Japanese relations at a nadir, at a low point? And why? Or why not? Alexis, do you want to start?
And I get to go first?
And I will enforce the 3 to 5 minute rule. So.
I have nadir in my notes. I want you to
nadir's a good word to
confirm that right there, because I like the word. I have a handout that I thought was supposed to be on everybody's chair, and it's on nobody's chair. So if Sean could perhaps, it's a cartoon from 1965, and it makes the point that You'll get it in a second, but it makes the point that what's noticeable to me is that we're not talking about the 50th anniversary of normalized relations this spring between Seoul and Tokyo. We're talking about the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, or the 70th anniversary of the division of Korea. And so I'd like to ask why, and why are relations at such a level that we are not establishing all of these celebratory joint sessions that we could and should be, I firmly believe, because we're chasing after words. And as I really feel for the journalists that are at this conference, you guys cannot possibly be sleeping at all because of the time difference with Abe's visit, but we're chasing after words. And we're chasing after what Raymond Williams has called keywords, words which house within them entire systems of belief. In this case, words such as aggression, remorse, etc. And so on this topic, one of the reasons that is clear that we're at such a low point is that the words that we are hoping get said, don't get said, or get said in a different way, reflect to me not so much a difference of one person's views versus the other, but we've got, I think, in the current Prime Minister of Japan, somebody with a different world view about the 20th century from what previous prime ministers, the ones who at first uttered the statements that we all want to hear again, and these are on both sides. I'm talking about Murayama and Koizumi, both have said the same words. Why is it that Prime Minister Abe can only uphold these words and not say them in their entirety? This, to me, is a very important distinction here, insofar as if you cannot say the sentence, does it matter that you're inheriting the policy? And this is a very significant statement that easily could be said, it's already written. We're not asking Mr. Abe to rewrite Mr. Murayama's statement. It is Japanese policy and Japan's view as decided upon at one point. The problem is in 1995, Prime Minister Abe walked out of the vote. He was so opposed to it as a young parliamentarian. So again, this is not, in my opinion, the topic came up in the previous panel this morning about East Asian relations and reordering. We're not dealing with revisionism here. All history is revision. That's the point of doing history. We're dealing with a different worldview of the 20th century. But what we're dealing with, therefore, with this different worldview that comes into relief, is that we're actually not talking about history. We're talking about memory. And so what we're doing in using the term history is actually looking from the outside at a whole bunch of competing interests arguing their preferred memory of the 20th century. The dangerous part of this is that history wars don't lead to actual war. Memory wars have actually been demonstrated, and Putin is the most recent example of being able to lead to open shooting. So if we could actually stop using the word history, not only the historians in the House would be happy, but I think we would be able to analyze what's going on in a different framework. Because no matter how many documents that Professor Togo and I demonstrate to have, I'm just pointing to Professor Togo because we've written together about these things, to prove one side versus another, that's a history debate. But evidence doesn't seem to matter right now. It's a preferred view. And when we're talking about that, it inherently becomes politicized. What can the US do in all of this? First of all, it cannot mediate this dispute in any way or form because it's part of this dispute. And the United States needs to recognize not only that it's a power in the region, but that there is profound American history in this history problem. And I'm happy to discuss what that is, but in that, with an eye to returning to this year as the year of the 50th, and therefore hopefully not ending on a nadir, is in everybody's interests, of course, to have the two leaders meet. I would call it speed dating even more than an arranged marriage meeting, but in my humble opinion, the best way to do that would be for Prime Minister Abe to come to Seoul for the 50th. And I'm not a policymaker, I have no ability to make this happen. But that, to me, would show the ability to meet, but it is Abe who should come here. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Professor Buck, do you want to take on the same question?
Alexis really relieved me of some burden. I don't have to talk about history as you talk. So I just wanted to stick to the kind of original theme of this panel. Never been worse. Yeah, we had very bad times in the past as well. I agree to the Scott Schneider's point. I read an interview with Joseon today, and then this is the kind of worst moment after 1998, after Obuchi Kim Dae-jung declaration. Definitely, this is the kind of worst moment. We cannot think of any other period that we had a worse relationship. We had the worst relationship before, but after 1998, this is the worst period. But looking back, I found some interesting pattern after discussing with the Japan specialists in Korea. We can find some kind of a historically similar period, like 1995 to 7. That was not a good period for Korea-Japan relations. The Ambassador Beshu was in charge of the Korea affairs at the time. I'm not blaming you that you made a harder time to make it back. But the thing is that two things looks very similar when we had a very difficult time. One, the long, relatively some liberal moment continued before we have a conservative backlash. If you remember 1998, the Obuchi Kim Dae-jung Code Declaration. Before that, we had a 1993 Kono statement, 1995 the Murayama statement. Hosokawa also made a very liberal speech. So that moment was regarded as the most liberal moment for Korea-Japan relations, and people found a kind of a good chance for historical reconciliation between the two. But interestingly enough, I would say that 1995 is the kind of starting moment of a conservative backlash. Many people are forgetting that even at the time, Abe Shinzo stood at the center of that Young Turks leading a strong conservative backlash. So if you think about now under Abe cabinet we have a harder time. But before, under the DPJ cabinet, we had a very good time. Under the DPJ cabinet, they had a very liberal attitude. They had a Khan Declaration and all these, the returning the cultural items. So we had a very good time, but conservatives made a strong backlash again. So this is obvious the backlash against the very liberal moment. So that's one commonality that I find when you have the difficult time. And second commonality I find is that if you look back in 1995, when South Korea normalized the relationship with China in 1992, and then the first Jiang Zemin's visit to Korea was 1995. At that time, when Kim Yong-sam and then Jiang Zemin talked, actually they talked about specific person at those Seichi, and then talk about the very provocative thing about Japan. 일본의 버르장머리를 고쳐놓겠다. I don't know. I can translate it into English properly. Anyway, they corrected the Japanese misconduct or misbehavior. So, actually, that signaled the kind of an impression that Korea and China are tying up to blame Japan, focusing on history issues. And at this moment, we are witnessing the similar pattern. Many people, especially in Japan, perceive this moment as a kind of a Korea and China tying up to blame Japan with the history issue focused. So it's a kind of very similar pattern. But I find this moment much more concerning in a sense that in 1995, we didn't that period we didn't see a kind of a surge of anti-Korean feeling at all in Japan. The Koreans, they continue to have an anti-Japanese sentiment. It's not an action, but a sentiment. But in Japan, nowadays, there's a kind of prevalent rhetoric about Genkan, Hankan. It's a kind of a very anti-Korean sentiments are coming up among the general populace. And then that kind of dialogue is not stopping only at the weekly magazines. If I meet that kind of a mainstream intellectuals and journalists in Japan, I hear the same story. wow, it's quite affected by this the Genkan kind of mood. And then at that time, long before I came in about 20 years ago, even though we had a kind of photo, also United States was encouraging us to go back to the original status. Actually, both parties listened to the American advice at that time. But it's not effectively working at this moment, even though United States continue to encourage us to get together, but still it's not working. And then political leaders are also different, even though even about 20 years ago there was a kind of a conservative hoax that say against it, but still the prime minister or cabinet ministers refrained from further provocation and then tried to stabilize the situation at the last moment. I don't see it under the Abe cabinet. So this is a kind of critical difference. But that's the reason why, as Martin said in the beginning, in Japan you find Korea fatigue. So so leave it Korea. So kind of, and then okay, pass over to China. And Korea passing phenomena is happening. Okay, so if you make a kind of great deal with China, Korea will eventually follow. I think it's kind of wrong, the presumption they have, but they're doing it. Actually, believe it or not, I feel a Japan fatigue in Korea because I talk to many people, many the journalists and the policymakers. We have the same fatigue. Wow, Japan talk about apology fatigue. We are talking about 망언 필요증. So it's all the Japanese politicians continue to make controversial remarks, continue to pay visit to Yasukuni Shrine, and then all those provocative things in the eyes of Koreans. So, oh, we are exhausted. So we wanted to pass over. It's a Japan passing phenomenon is happening here, actually, emotionally. So that gives a kind of very troubled time for us at this moment. So. If I make a kind of my last a short comment, I think we are at some different stage of the relationship. Old normal doesn't work anymore. In the past, Japan accepted many of the Korean requests and then gave much more deeper consideration about what Koreans are concerned, but not anymore. Japan wants to have a one-to-one state-to-state normal relationship rather than setting up a special relationship. So we don't have to expect that much from a kind of new Japan. Also, Japan doesn't know that Korea is very different from the past. We will never kneel down, we will never surrender, we will never step back. So because we have much more confidence than before and we can handle the situation. So what should be done? I think at this stage we are at the process of adapting to each other. New finding, wow, Japan is different. Wow, Korea is different. So whether we can find a kind of a new equilibrium between us, finding a new solution to this problem, that's a kind of we're in the period of testing. So I don't know. I'm not that much optimistic, but neither I'm not that much pessimistic. So I think we have to. I will continue to discuss this issue after this remark. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Nishino. Do you want to go next?
Yeah. Thank you, moderator. And first of all, thank you the people in South Korea for closely paying attention to the Abe's visit to the Washington D.C. I was a bit surprised. So all coverage of TV program is now sending Abe's visit to the Washington D.C. So I really understand the South Korea's concern, South Korean sentiment towards Japan on historical issue. I live in Korea over 7 years. But at the same time, I'd like to say that this time, Prime Minister Abe delivered his speech, he delivered his word on past, present, and future in the context of the U.S. and Japan relation. So yes, he can speak his perception or his recognition on history on another appropriate occasion, such as U.S.-Japan summit meeting. I really hope that this will happen as soon as possible. This is one thing, one point I'd like to say. So just two things I want to say. The first one is now, yeah, we really know that the current difficulty, we have really difficulty really at the summit level on the historical issue. So many growing number of experts abandoning any hope for our summit meeting under the Park and Abe administration. However, my point is that the deterioration in our relationship is not due solely to the chemistry between the two leaders. It stems a large part from the changes in the international political or international structure in East Asia, especially surrounding Japan-ROK relations. So in particular, differing perspectives on the rise of China have destabilized relations between Tokyo and Seoul. So Japan views China at this point as a military threat, unfortunately, in part due to the Senkaku Island issue. While the South Korea has seemingly begun to view Japan's security posture vis-à-vis China as a potential threat. So for example, in a CJK opinion poll conducted by the Asahi Shimbun in last year, the top response in Japan on the country you feel poses the military threat was China, 55%, followed by the North Korea, 29%. While respondents in South Korea put the DPRK North Korea, 60% first, then next, Japan, 20%. And third, China, only 10%. So when asked which do you consider more important for your country, the US or China? In a joint Yomiuri Shimbun and Hangul Ilbo opinion poll conducted last year. So Japanese heavily favored the US, 74%, over China, 14%. While South Koreans were nearly evenly split between the US, 47%, and China, 46%. So in sum, differing assessment of present and future China are causing a divergence in security policy between Japan and South Korea, at the same time encouraging the mutual distrust or paranoia. So the second thing I want to say is that it goes without saying that the understanding and support of the people of both countries are essential to further development of Japan and ROK relations. But very unfortunately, the deterioration in sentiment toward South Korea is serious now in Japan at this moment. A poll conducted by the Cabinet Office last autumn shows the percentage of Japanese who do not feel an affinity with South Korea at an all-time high of 66%. Very serious. The fatigue you are all saying they feel when South Korea raises historical issue continues to cause many Japanese to lose sight of just how important with ROK are for Japan. So I think now is a time has come for both two leaders to distance themselves from the short-sighted, emotionally loaded arguments, and to highlight the importance of the relationship relationship between Tokyo and Seoul based on the long-term vision. So because now we will mark 50th anniversary of our relationship. Okay, I'll stop it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Scott, do you want to finish us off?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate what Nishino-san had to say, something a little bit more positive about the possibility that the two countries should grasp this moment. I also very much try to resist the overall pessimism surrounding this particular relationship. It's true that public opinion in both countries toward each other is trending negative, but you know, the title of the conference is the U.S. back? If the U.S. is back, the best evidence of a U.S. assertion of power should be in its capacity to stabilize, to create a stabilizing environment for a relationship between its two closest allies in Northeast Asia. Frankly, I would make the argument that that's actually more important for the success of the rebalance than the future of TPP. If our allies can't get along with each other, then we have a bigger problem. We have a bigger problem that prevents us from being able to grapple with this larger strategic challenge of the rise of China that everybody points to. And so, you know, the other aspect is the U.S. has put forward this rebalancing strategy, which I think changes the framework a little bit for how we think about alliances, because it does very much imply that rather than just a hub and spokes, that the spokes are going to work with each other. And so I think that there is an expectation, implicit or explicit now, in the U.S. approach to alliance relations in the region, that allies should at least have stable relations with each other. And so I think over the course of the past couple of years, evidence that the Obama administration is trying to grapple with this question of how do you stabilize the relationship between Japan and South Korea. Now, one thing I think that the Obama administration has learned through experience is, you know, that the first blush analysis, the factors that Martin laid out of common interests and common values, you know, from a realist perspective, that's enough. But in this relationship, there's something deeper. And I have a book co-authored with Brad Wasserman coming out about the identity issues in the Japan-South Korea relationship that are deeper than just the realist construct of, well, if they both are democratic market economies, they should get along with each other. And so what I think is interesting is that I think U.S. policymakers have also found themselves having to grapple with the fact that the identity issues are at the core. One way that we can see this is that U.S. policymakers, frankly, have run into problems with perceptions that they are trying to be even-handed when they describe the relationship. Wendy Sherman ran into that problem a few months ago. I think Ash Carter even ran into problems with that just a couple of weeks ago. But really, you know, since the end of 2013 and the run-up to the Hague Summit, I think that was really the first round of the U.S. actually getting its hands dirty and trying to crank start this old car and try to make it go forward. And I would say that the Hague Summit, you know, it was a nice crank starting effort, but it didn't make the car go. We're not mediating. We are facilitating. I think the U.S. government is trying to create that environment. And so now I think we're actually in the second phase of a crank starting effort with Prime Minister Abe in Washington. I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. government officials have stated expectations that the history issue be dealt with. In fact, Evan Medeiros just last Friday, senior official in the Obama administration, made what I thought was a quite striking comment. He said, we always stress the importance of addressing history questions in an honest, constructive, and forthright manner that promotes healing, but also in a way that promotes a final resolution. I mean, this suggests to me that the Obama administration is more than knee-deep into the effort to create an enabling environment for Japan and South Korea to move toward a lasting reconciliation. Because frankly, if the situation goes as it currently exists, it's like the U.S., Japan, and South Korea working together, but in an environment where the ceiling is too low. It's like being in a room where there's a 5-foot ceiling. But obviously, in order to be effective in addressing the challenges of the 21st century, there's going to have to be more than that. And I think that the U.S. government is aware of it and has begun to, you know, not mediate, but has definitely been delving into the issues that are necessary to create some boundaries in terms of what is acceptable on how to talk about history, and also to try to jumpstart an effort that ultimately, if it's going to really yield real fruit, is going to have to be carried forward by Japanese and South Korean leaders acting together as statesmen, statespersons, to reframe the relationship.
Thank you, Scott. We've had an interesting start because if I understand Mr. Puck and Mr. Nishino, you were saying that the core problem between South Korea and Japan may be geopolitical change, right? Change in the region, rise of Korea, perhaps rise of China, right? Whereas Alexis and Scott were talking more about Alexis memory, Scott identity. What do you think is the core thing that's keeping Japan and Korea apart? I mean, if you're going to talk to a lay audience, as we are today, why can't they see eye to eye? Is it really geopolitics disguised as memory or history, or is it really the sort of essential feelings about their past? Or it's very perplexing to outsiders why these two countries with so much in common can't get along.
Can I start?
Yes.
I think in the beginning of the Abe and Park Geun-hye administration, mutually had two higher expectation. I think, and they didn't lower it down afterwards. And then pretty much disappointed about each other at this moment. But I think underlying factor is that, of course, the geopolitical change and power transition that is taking place in East Asia matters, and it affected. But in a twisted way, because if I just focus on the Japanese way of understanding Korea, I think there is some kind of misperception and misunderstandings. Korea have lots of misunderstandings about Japan, I acknowledge, but Japan come to have developed a kind of lots of misunderstanding and misperception. First of all, I hear all those stories from my friends. One, Korea is too much tilted toward China. Yes, if you look at the superficial value, right? Because President Park had the summit meeting with Xi Jinping more than 5 times, right? So, but you don't talk to Abe. So, and then you have a lot of exchange going on between Korea and China, but you don't find it that much between Korea and Japan. They are forgetting that we have developed lots of multi-layered exchange and cooperation at several levels between Korea and Japan already. So we don't have to be surprised. We are developing a new development with China. So they're surprised, Korea is just moving to China. So I don't think, and then some even say that, possibly Korea will be away from the United States. How can? I don't think we can, Korea will get away from the alliance with the United States. That's a wrong perception about Korea. And the another perception is that Korea is not a kind of a democratic country, they say. So I think we had a mistake of holding Sankei bureau chief for too long. I think that was the tactical mistake for Korea. But we released him recently. But other than that, some Japanese weekly magazines and others, right-wingers, say that Korea is not a democratic country. This is a poverty of democracy in Korea. No. I find excessive democracy in Korea rather than the poverty of democracy. They're too democratic in Korea, so that's the problem rather than a lack of democracy. And then pretty much a misunderstanding about anti-Japanese attitude from on the Korean side. Yes, Koreans have anti-Japanese sentiment as we had a very tragic the history in modern times, but it is not revealed in action, except a kind of a Wednesday meeting in front of the Japanese embassy, the Comfort Women's Convention. I cannot find any anti-Japanese demonstration. I invited one intellectual from Japan 2 weeks ago. He went to the bookstore, and as you can find so many anti-Korean books in any bookstore in Japan. He tried to find some anti-Japanese book written by Korean or anybody. He couldn't find any. So he was so surprised. Why? We have so many anti-Korean books in Japan, but you don't find any in Korea when you talk about the Japanese thing. So it's a kind of, so anti-Japanese feeling is there, but it's not revealed in action. It's just different from the anti-Korean movement in the Japanese society. I'm worried about that.
But I mean, you see, like from the U.S. perspective, like you see the Korean demonstrations, you see these statues in California, and in Japan, it always comes up this, Japan has apologized before, right? 1993, the Kono Statement, 95, Murayama, 98, the Kim Dae-jung visit with Prime Minister Obuchi. I mean, hasn't Japan apologized enough?
As for an apology, she is an expert.
But that's Murakami Haruki's statement last week was one of the bravest remarks to come out of Japan in recent years. You know, you have, if you are the perpetrator, you have to apologize and apologize and apologize until it's not an issue anymore. And I guess that's also something that I think is a US responsibility and also a Korean responsibility, and that is to hear more Japanese voices. It's not Abe all the time. And I wanted to carry that sign, I am not Abe, because I'm not anti-Japanese, it's just I'm not Abe, in the sense of what Japanese, when we use the word, the totally unhelpful word, the Japanese, the Koreans, there are majority views, there are minority views, but if you are the leader of a country, you have to set the bar. And I think you know, what's been raised is that one of the problems we've seen is that I think in both Tokyo and Seoul, beginning in the early 1990s, leaders were surprised by what democracy would entail. And what it entailed was that this relationship was going to hit the streets and become part of South Korean democratization, but also equally important, when Emperor Hirohito died in 1989, a very significant shift in publication law in Japan happened, which was you were allowed to publish about war responsibility. When I first started studying in Japan in the late 1980s, studying these topics meant high school teachers taking their students out into the fields to dig up bones of slave labor to prove that this history had happened. But you could go to any good bookstore in Tokyo and not find these books published, readily available. You could find them at Todai Library if they were able to find a publisher. But now you go to a good bookstore, and if you can get through all of the anti-Korea, anti-China books, you find huge shelves of war responsibility studies. You can get a PhD in peace studies and war responsibility studies because Hirohito's death meant that this was publicly discussable information, that the history had happened. At the same time, democracy hit the streets in not just South Korea, but maybe we could also talk about the rest of the empire, because there was that larger empire. And that's really what this is a piece of, was a massive part of the planet under Japanese control. And maybe Korea got it worse because it was under the longest militarized occupation of the entire area, to the extent that Koreans, by 1930, it's a very different worldview. Who are you? What are you going to become? The location of this conference is significant. We're on Namsan, right? The Chosen Shrine is just at the peak of the hill behind us. It's not there anymore because Seoul Tower is. But all of this city had been reoriented to bow to the sun goddess of Japan until 1945. Stuff like that doesn't just go away overnight, no matter how much a policymaker in Washington wants it to. But if you stay in the Hyatt, you can't see that history, and I think that's been part of Washington's problem, is understanding what Scott's talking about identity. And what this is we're not saying that this is not manageable, but that it hit the streets means that different kinds of management become required. And I think that that, at least from a total layperson outsider, has been what's been the noticeable shock, is watching the leaders try to respond to this. Totally unrelated, but maybe related, I see President Xi Jinping copying Park Chung-hee right now. When I look at how he approaches history issues, I look at the 1960s here. Because here in the 1960s, particularly 1965, it was illegal to protest Korea. But you were allowed to protest Japan, and so when you look at all the protest pictures in front of City Hall for 1965, they are all about the Ri line, the Dokdo. It's all about that, because you could vent your anger at the state by protesting Japan, because you get arrested if you protested Korea. But you don't get arrested for protesting Korea now, which is a good thing. unless you're in North Korea.
You were arrested in the 80s.
You were arrested in the 80s, right, but that's what I'm saying. Democracy doesn't hit until really the 90s, and it hits just when all of these issues explode.
I'm going to read a quote here. I am deeply pained to think about the comfort women who experience immeasurable pain and suffering as victims of human trafficking. That was Abe Shinzo yesterday in Washington. Is there anything that Abe could say to fix the problem?
Just add by the state of Japan.
Would that really fix it, though? I mean, is it
Well,
that
it would
easy?
uphold the Kono statement. It would uphold the Murayama apology. It would uphold Japan's already stated
Is
acceptance.
it really that legalistic, though? I mean, are the Korean people going to say, hey, you know what? We had a little check 1, check 2, check 3.
No.
Okay, we can have good
But that's
relations
where the
now.
Korean government
give
has
you a
to
checklist.
accept.
I don't like the term human trafficking.
Yeah.
Possibly the Japanese nuance and then the English nuance may be different, but I think Abe picked up a wrong word in a sense that it gives an impression that the human trafficking happened by private criminal group. So it doesn't say anything about who did for what. So it's human trafficking, oh, that happened by somebody else, not me, not Japanese government or Japanese military. So even though Abe may have a good intention to deliver pain, to share the pains of the victimized people, I don't think that's a good word to deliver the message.
Mr. Nishino, there's a
No,
good chance that Mr. Abe will be in power for several more years to come. Can this relationship be fixed under Mr. Abe, do you think?
I personally think that Prime Minister Abe can do more if President Park try to tackle this issue jointly or try to work together. But at this point, President Park always say that please show first your sincere attitude towards comfort women issue. Yes, we can. But our concern, Japanese concern, is that then if we do show additional sincere attitude, then what South Korean government will do? So many people in Japan now see that President Park, South Korean government, cannot persuade, especially NGO who is supporting Harmonizer, to compromise with Japan. So this is the problem. So if I always say that we Japan and South Korea need to work together or tackle comfort women issue. And as you all know that now in Japan there's a very frustration about apology, especially on comfort women issue. So we Japanese addressed the comfort women issue very headed on in the 1990s by such means as establishing the Asian Women Fund. But its explanation and dissemination of information on the issue, both at home in Japan and abroad, proved insufficient. So unfortunately, now Japan's past efforts are almost entirely unknown, not only in Japan, but also in South Korea. And they have not accorded any positive regard. So this is the current Japanese, general Japanese sentiment.
You make a good point, because wasn't the Murayama statement and the fund, weren't these supposed to resolve the comfort women issue? You also had the 1998 meeting between Kim Dae-jung and Obuchi, and it seemed like the two sides had agreed to put this behind them. Mm-hmm. What happened?
I think from South Korea's perspective, yes. From Japanese perspective, we really reconciliated in 1998 when DJ Kim Dae-jung and Obuchi declared a new joint declaration. But unfortunately, 3 years after, Prime Minister Koizumi at that time visited Yasukuni Shrine. So this really, I think, deteriorated our reconciliation. But I always say we have to back to the spirit of 1998. Yes, the circumstances surrounding us really changed, but still we can back to the 1998 spirit. So if you see when you see the joint declaration in 1998, Japanese side really apologized the past, and more importantly, Kim Dae-jung at that time accepted apology from Japanese side, from Prime Minister Obuchi, and Kim Dae-jung, really highly appreciated Japanese contribution to the post-World War II world. So this is very important. So we have to really back to this mutual understanding and respect.
Wasn't it Merkel who said that the other side has to accept the apology, right? It's not a one-way street, it's a two-way.
I think that's the one point I wanted to raise. I think I agree with the Nishino-san about 2 points about what Korea should do. First of all, we Korea do not usually appreciate what the Japan's sincere efforts when they make efforts. When they apologize, they just take it for granted. So we do not give a kind of enough credit to the Japanese efforts. I think we have to change that attitude. At the same time, Koreans, we have, because of the anti-Japanese feeling, always do not try to forgive Japan, whatever they do. So it's just a kind of, that's the Japanese responsibility, and we have nothing to do. So we have to change. If Korea is a really proud nation, we have to have the courage to forgive Japan at some moment, as long as Japan do the right thing. But the problem here is that for the apology, why we continue to ask apology? The thing is that there are 3 problems here. One, the Japanese way of saying sorry is different from others. I gave you a kind of interview long before. Rather than saying sorry, period, it's saying sorry, comma, but. So you have some different messages coming up. Right? Even though I feel so sorry, but we did a good thing for you in the past. Not good. So this is a kind of sending a mixed signal to Koreans. So if you wanted to say sorry, just to say sorry, period. And the second, the kind of the double standard possibly to satisfy the domestic public. Like we said it just before. Well, when Abe made a kind of talk about remorse about the invasion in the past. More than 100 the Japanese politicians visited Yasukuni Shrine on the same day. What is the kind of honne and what is the tatemae? So we all see all these double standards. So if you just say sorry and then have a remorse and apology, follow it. Some group in the Japanese society are doing something else, is saying something else. So this is kind of frustrating to us. That's the reason why we have Japan fatigue at the same time. And then final thing, you should be consistent. We are not asking, for example, to Abe that you have to make a kind of new apologies. Rather than that, keep the standard you kept in the past. Abe, the Kono Declaration statement, and Abe, the Murayama Declaration, just to stick to it. But while saying that I'm going to inherit it, sometimes they revise it, sometimes they say that I just accepted, inherited it in its entirety. I don't want to reiterate the same words again. So what is it? Is it really inheriting as it is, or trying to revise it in some way? So it makes us very confusing, suspicious, and doubtful.
Do you think Japan has apologized enough, Mr. Park? Do you think Japan has apologized enough?
I think formally, yes. If you see the official statement, yes. I think they apologized. But the thing is that the other groups in the Japanese society, the right-wingers say totally different things. Even in the ruling party, there is some segment of the right-wing oriented politicians who say totally different things. So then, how can you have to control the domestic backlash?
There's actually a tangible way to understand. Could I read? I quoted a little bit from the Kono statement to read to every. Sorry, I'm a teacher, but this is the key part that is really being eviscerated right now, and it is we shall face squarely the historical facts as described above instead of evading them, and take them to heart as lessons of history. We hereby reiterate our firm determination never to repeat the same mistake by forever engraving such issue in our memories through the study and teaching of history. That's 1993, and when the 2015 textbooks come out and we're reduced to only one middle school book that will allow the word in it, then it's in blatant violation of the Kono Declaration. So it does not matter whether you inherit the sentiment of it. You're simply negating it. And so while we all probably won't be alive for the effects of this, this is why it's particularly dangerous to consider what we're talking about as anything other than forming an entirely alienating view of the other. Sorry.
I want to go to some questions from the floor for a second. Mr. Nishino, you go next, and then Scott, I wanted to ask you about a U.S. role. You mentioned U.S. as facilitator, I believe is what you said. If you could maybe delve a bit more deeply in what the U.S. can do here, but let's first go to Mr. Nishino.
Yeah, I really totally agree with Professor Park's comment, and but at the same time, so I think South Koreans always try to focusing on Abe-san's honne part. But now he is really the leader of the Japan and the Japanese government, top of Japanese government. So after he's taking office in the end of 2012, from my perspective, he really has tried to keep low profile. Yes, he really says provocative words during his campaign in late 1920. But now, so he upholds Kohn and Murayama's statement, and I really want South Korean side to see the kind of the dynamism inside Japan. Right. So there is a various discussion in Japan. So because we are a very democratic society, but we converge this opinion, this serious discussion. To the yes, we have to uphold Kohn and Murayama's statement, and we have to support a 1998 joint declaration. This is a Japan's decision. So I really want South Korean side to see this dynamism, and yes, there is a various discussion in Japan, and there's also a concern about Abe-san's honne in Japan. But now he's a leader of Japanese government, and I really want everyone to see Abe-san's behavior as a top of Japanese government.
Thank you. Scott, could you delve into the U.S. role?
I think there are two things. There are probably more than two things that the United States can do, but I think there are two things that the U.S. is actually involved in doing to some degree at this stage. One is basically establishing guardrails for this relationship so that it doesn't careen off the mountain, to try to keep Korea and Japan, basically to create an environment where Korea is kind of inside the tent on Japan's domestic political debate, and Japan is inside the tent on Korea's domestic political debate. In other words, reminding governments that they need to consider the views and perspectives of the other. And then I think the other role that the U.S. is currently engaged in playing or needs to try to play is to basically help both sides hear each other, because the medias and the publics are distorting. It's hard to hear the messages, right? So you quoted Prime Minister Abe from the press conference about his statement on when he was asked about the comfort women issue. And then after that, he did state that it was Japanese government policy to uphold the Kono statement. And that means that it is all of our responsibility to make sure that the Japanese government upholds the Kono statement. But, on the other side, President Park actually made some positive comments about Japan's post-war role in the world in her March 1st speech. I didn't see much media coverage of that here, but it was there. And I think that both sides need to have someone help to interpret and remove some of the distortions that are part of that discussion that come in the public discourse.
Okay, I'd like to open the floor to questions. If you could identify yourself, and I'm going to ask you to keep it brief, not comments, but questions, please. I'm going to cut you off if I get comments. The gentleman here in the front with the beige shirt first, and I'll get the gentleman in the back next.
Yes, Stefan Seoul Village. I wonder if one of the core problems for Korea is not to accept the fact that the agenda is mostly national, not nationalist, but national, and to put typically the universal cause of sexual slavery on a nationalistic level, which undermines the cause, whilst, and to put the equation as Japan versus Korea, where it's at the core of it, it's fundamentally about Imperial Japan versus post-war Japan, or as the Ministry of Education states it, to undo 70 years of destruction of Japan. That's how he sees post-war Japan. So typically, historical revisionism is just one side of an agenda, the Abe or Nippon Kaigi agenda, which is restoration of state Shinto, monarchism, militarism, and also patriotic studying at school. So as Korea undermined its core cause by putting it on the nationalist agenda, well, it's counterproductive.
You want to take that one, Alexis?
Did you want to take
I'm sorry, I'm afraid I couldn't catch the question exactly.
If you reduced it, because I saw, could you get it down to one sentence? I lost you halfway through.
It's just how Korea put it on the Korea versus Japan, while it should be on the Imperial Japan versus post-war Japan, and
that's
typically when...
That's what I thought you meant, and that's where Scott's point is really germane, and actually what all three of my colleagues have been saying, that this really is less Japan versus another country. Korea is the one that makes the news more than, say, the Philippines or Indonesia, but if we're talking about Imperial Japan, those cases are as relevant. And so, yes, absolutely, we're talking about a history debate inside Japan about how to narrate the country's past and future. Elements of that debate have become so highly politicized that they're used as sort of diplomatic weapons against one another. And the problem is that the focus has shifted on to how international relations is being affected by this spillover debate. It's actually a very exciting time to study the debate inside Japan, precisely because the divergence of views. And here I would urge your attention to discussions over the changes to the Constitution, because that's the big ticket item inside Japan, and not just Article 9. That's again where everybody focuses, because it has to be about Japan's military. Japan has a military. We have to, this is not news. The question is, what should Japan's military be used for? And that's the active debate inside Japan, which you never read about, but is a very, very profoundly important debate for the entire conference theme.
In the back, is that Ed? I can't see. Is that the gentleman with the white shirt and the tie?
That's a lot of people. I'm Edward Dong. I'm from the U.S. Embassy. It strikes me that we're underestimating the degree of actually pretty good relations at various levels that are down from the level of the leaders. But even at the leaders level, I think that we shouldn't underestimate that Koreans and Japanese are in fact working to try to effect a meeting. I cite as evidence, for example, there was recently a foreign minister's trilateral, and it had a very, very interesting statement. Well, first off, that foreign minister's trilateral had not taken place for 3 years, and they had not issued a statement for 5 years. But in that statement, there was a very peculiar, I think a very important thing. It said, well, the three foreign ministers agreed that they would deal with the issues of history in a, squarely face it, and with a view towards the future. Well, to me, that's sort of a compromise, if you look at other statements. And the whole point of that is that's supposed to lead to some trilateral summit meeting, which in Seoul, which probably the meeting between Park Geun-hye and Abe Shinzo should occur. And so it's within that context. So I think that we shouldn't be so despairing. And I think that since this is about identity and about perceptions, I know Nishino-san's one of his colleagues at Keio University, Professor Soeya. I think his point is very simple.
Is there a question that you have
Oh, no,
to ask?
I'm sorry, it's a comment. So empathy, can empathy work? And how can we realize empathy? Because I really think that Professor Soya is onto something.
Thank you, Ed. Ambassador Togo, do you want to have a question? And maybe I'll ask folks to address the comment and the question.
May I offer one comment and one question? About the comment.
Just keep it brief, please.
Yeah.
We're running out of time.
I have been trying to tell the Japanese people that Korean fatigue is wrong. We have to put our shoes in the mind of the Koreans. And then 35 years of colonialism. We have to understand what it meant to Korea. And I've written repeatedly in Japan, and my book is one of the books which is hidden in the shelf, which you have mentioned. It's there. It's not on the forefront. And I think, there are many people who shares my view. Now, but against this background, still question rises. Japan-Korea relation from 1998 to 2005, roughly, was really good. There was a real expectation, and it was a leading relation for Japan in the whole East Asia. And still, why this is happening? And one question I want to ask anyone. There is a feeling that the confidence in Korea now is translated into a kind of attack to Japan on memory. And this is symbolized in the 2012 Korean Supreme Court decision on enforced labor. Mm-hmm. And the gist is that 1965 agreement does not cover issues related to history because it is not meeting Korean criteria of what historical and what colonization should mean. And this, the Japanese cannot understand, and this is translated into actions to nearly 300 Japanese companies working in Korea.
Can you come to this the question?
So the question, this Korean new judicial war against Japan, how should we understand? And few Japanese would sympathize with this judicial war.
Okay. First, Scott, would you respond to Ed's comment? Because I think he was talking about kind of what you were talking to before. And then, Mr. Park, you were talking about the rise of Korea and kind of, I think, getting to what Ambassador Togo was saying. Would you respond to the second one?
Well, I do think that both sides have to try to understand the positions of the other, and that's what I mean when I talk about reframing identity in a shared way. I mean, after all, look at the Korean calendar, and you can count holidays that are basically focused on bad things that Japan did. Is there a way to reframe that in order to have a day to celebrate friendship, potentially, in the context of a reframed relationship?
Thank you.
Okay, I agree with the Ambassador Togo about two things. One, I think Korea-Japan relations has been an awful successful story for the past 50 years, actually. It was a win-win relationship. That's the reason why we are frustrated at the moment. As Ed said, the kind of people-to-people relationship is very good. We are underestimating that phenomena and then just kind of take it for granted. The reason why we are frustrated is that because the political leaders have the luxury of fighting each other because the people-to-people relationship are so good. So I think it's a kind of spoiling the situation. That's the reason why we have the sense that we can do better than this. Korea and Japan can better cooperate than this. That's the reason why we have the frustration, rather than this is a kind of totally broken relationship. So that's the source of the frustration. So, and the second, I think both governments, Korea and Japan government, made utmost efforts to make things better so far, but it's not working. It's the problem of political leaders, rather than Ambassador Besho or the foreign ministry people. Some people on the top is not so taking this issue very flexibly. I think we have to change the situation, and in that sense, I think the over judicial intervention into the diplomatic affairs too much should be avoided.
I think can I do a 10-second question? Does someone have a 5 or 10-second question they want to ask that we could briefly answer? 5 or 10 seconds. I'm going to cut you off. Go. Sorry.
Kevin Kim from the State Department. Under the assumption that the Korea-Japan relations does get improved on the history front, what are the implications for Japan's history issues with China then?
Excellent. Give this guy, Ed, this guy gets a raise. Anybody want to answer that? Regional, Mr. Nishino, you were talking about regional issues, regional geopolitics. Do you want to try that? Or?
Yes, but I want to say is that yes, geopolitics is really giving a serious negative impact on our relationship. But at the same time, related to Togo Sensei's question, now at the same time, domestic politics or domestic dynamism on history issue is really giving a negative impact on current relations between Tokyo and Seoul. After the democratization in South Korea, so now South Korea, in South Korea there is a serious discussion or controversy on South Korea's history itself. So as Professor Doden suggested, it's quite natural. So, but at the same time, this domestic discussion is giving a serious negative impact to Japan and South Korea. And we've seen 2011-8 Constitutional Court decision is really a very heavy burden for both Japan and South Korean leaders. So we have to escape this kind of negative spiral. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've identified maybe 3 layers of challenges of a wind blowing in the face of Korea and Japan. One is the geopolitical change, the rise of Korea, the rise of China, relative decline of Japan and perhaps the US, which gets us back to this issue. The second one is domestic politics in both countries, and issues of nationalism and right-wing groups and this sort of thing. And then the third one is the personal dynamics of the 2 leaders, it sounds like. But nonetheless, it also sounds like we have reason for optimism. As you said, there are lots of ties already underway between the countries, and that things can also get better. So it's not all bad news. Well, thank you very much for speaking today, and thank you very much for coming. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers.